I was screaming his name into the storm when I realized he was never coming back, and the sound of my own voice scared me more than the thunder rolling through the Blue Ridge. My name is Claire Morgan. I was 22 years old, and that night I understood with terrifying clarity that being young didn't protect you from being abandoned. My hands were slick with rain and blood, my legs shaking so badly I had to brace myself against the rough wooden door of the chapel, and the baby in my arms let out a thin, exhausted cry that cut straight through me. Ethan had promised he'd meet me there before nightfall, promised he wouldn't let me be alone, and as the wind tore through the trees and the dark pressed in from every side, I finally understood that his promises were the kind that dissolve the moment they're tested, so why had I believed him at all? It had started 2 days earlier, in a borrowed cabin that smelled like damp pine and old smoke, the kind of place people use for hunting season and then forget about. I'd gone into labor before dawn, the pain sharp and relentless, each wave leaving me weaker and more aware of how far I was from everything familiar. Ethan paced the floor at first, phone pressed to his ear, whispering urgently, stepping outside again and again like the air itself might give him answers. When I asked who he kept calling, he told me it was work, that things were complicated, that I needed to focus on breathing instead of questioning him. I wanted to believe him because believing felt easier than facing the truth that had been hovering at the edges of my mind for weeks. By the time the baby arrived, slick and warm and impossibly small, Ethan was quiet, his face pale in a way I hadn't seen before. And when I held my daughter against my chest, all I could think was that whatever happened next, I had to protect her. The truth slipped out later that morning, not in a confession but in fragments, like something broken he couldn't put back together. He sat on the edge of the bed, wouldn't look at me, kept rubbing his hands on his jeans like he was trying to erase himself. When I asked him what was wrong, really wrong, he told me there was something I needed to know before this went any further. His voice was steady, too steady, and when he finally said he was married, that his wife was the daughter of a state senator, the words landed with a dull finality that made it hard to breathe. I remember staring at the knot in the wood on the wall behind him, listening as he explained the scandal, the damage, how this baby could ruin everything he'd built. He said he loved me, said that part like it should soften the rest, and then said we needed time, space, a plan. I didn't cry then. I just held my daughter tighter and felt something inside me close up. By afternoon, he was gone. Not dramatically, not with shouting or slammed doors, but quietly, efficiently, like someone stepping out of a room they'd decided no longer mattered. He left money on the table, wouldn't meet my eyes, and told me he'd come back once he figured things out. I watched his car disappear down the narrow mountain road, the sound of it swallowed by the trees, and waited longer than I should have for him to return. The cabin grew colder as the sky darkened, the first heavy drops of rain tapping against the roof, and with no cell service and no one else for miles, panic set in fast and unforgiving. When the contractions started again, sharp and wrong, I wrapped my daughter in the only clean blanket I had and stepped outside, the storm already turning the path into mud. I don't remember deciding to go to the chapel so much as I remember moving, one step at a time, guided by a vague memory of a small wooden building I'd seen on the drive up. The rain soaked through my clothes, plastered my hair to my face, and every breath burned as I climbed, my body aching in ways I didn't know it could. The chapel appeared suddenly through the mist, its door crooked, a single window glowing faintly from the reflection of lightning. Inside, it was empty, smelling of old wood and dust, and I sank to the floor, shaking, rocking my daughter as she whimpered against me. I whispered apologies into her hair, told her I was sorry, that I loved her, that I'd fix this somehow, even as my strength drained away and the fear grew louder than my thoughts. When I placed her down beside the altar, it felt like tearing something essential out of my chest. I tucked the blanket around her, pressed my lips to her forehead, and left the silver necklace my mother had given me resting against her tiny hand, the only proof that she'd been mine. The storm howled outside as I stumbled back into the dark, every step away from the chapel a betrayal I swore I'd undo. By morning, the rain had stopped, the world washed clean and silent, and when I forced myself to go back, heart pounding with hope and dread tangled together, the space beside the altar was empty. The blanket was gone, the necklace was gone, and standing there alone, I knew my life had split into two versions of myself, the girl who left and the woman who would one day come back. I learned to answer to a different name because the old one hurt too much to carry through airports and office lobbies, and by the time I was 36, people in Manhattan knew me as Victoria Hale, a woman who never flinched, never explained herself, and never talked about where she came from. I told myself the reinvention was survival, not erasure, even as I woke up most nights with my heart racing, my hands searching the dark for a weight that hadn't been there in 14 years, and I wondered how a person could become so polished on the outside while something feral and unfinished stayed alive underneath. New York gave me what the mountains never could, noise loud enough to drown memory if I let it. I lived on the Upper West Side in an apartment with windows that looked straight into other windows, a reminder that privacy is a luxury you can buy if you earn enough. My days were predictable in the way success demands. Coffee from the same place on Amsterdam Avenue, black, no sugar. A walk past the same brownstone where the doorman nodded like we were in on the same secret. Meetings stacked back to back, my calendar controlled to the minute because control felt like safety. I built a consulting firm that specialized in rescuing failing mid-sized companies, stepping in quietly, reorganizing their finances, and stepping out richer, cleaner, untouched. People called me sharp, untouchable. They didn't know I slept with a silver necklace in my bedside drawer, wrapped in tissue like a fragile truth I couldn't throw away. Every night, the dream came anyway. Sometimes it was the chapel, empty and echoing. Sometimes it was a baby crying somewhere I couldn't reach. And sometimes it was nothing but fog and the certainty that I was running out of time. I'd wake up before dawn, my body already braced for loss, and I'd lie there listening to the city breathe, telling myself that grief doesn't expire, it just learns to wait. I never married again. I dated carefully, strategically, men who admired me more than they knew me, and when they asked about children, I answered lightly, saying it just hadn't happened, watching their faces for reactions like I was collecting data. I didn't tell anyone the truth because saying it out loud would make it real again, and I wasn't sure I could survive that a second time. The past found me on a Tuesday morning in November, disguised as work. My assistant had printed a dossier for a potential client, left it on my desk with a yellow sticky note that said, "Big Fish." I skimmed it between calls, barely paying attention until a familiar cadence in the writing made my chest tighten. The name at the top didn't register at first. It was the background section that did. Southern Investments, political donors, a foundation connected to a state senator. I felt the room tilt as I read further, my fingers cold against the paper. The man who'd once promised me everything was now the CEO of a regional development firm expanding aggressively into the Northeast, positioning himself for something bigger, cleaner, public. The article mentioned his family, his wife's lineage, his reputation for integrity. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor, my heart hammering like it had something to prove. I spent the rest of the day pretending to be functional while something inside me rearranged itself. In the restroom, I locked myself into a stall and pressed my forehead against the door, breathing slowly, deliberately, the way I'd learned in therapy years earlier when my panic attacks still had teeth. I told myself this didn't change anything. I told myself I'd built a life that didn't include him. I told myself coincidence doesn't mean destiny. By the time I got home, my jaw ached from clenching, and I poured a glass of wine I didn't finish, sitting on the edge of my couch with my laptop balanced on my knees like it was a weapon. I searched him the way only someone with time and resources can, pulling public records, old interviews, archived photos. There he was, older, broader, his hair threaded with gray, smiling the same careful smile I remembered, like he always knew where the camera was. I learned about his philanthropy, his family values, the way journalists described him as disciplined and loyal. I felt something brittle crack open in me as I read, a soundless break that didn't hurt right away. What hurt was the ease with which he'd moved on, the way the world had rewarded him for surviving a scandal I'd been crushed by. I whispered his name into my empty apartment, tasting it like a challenge, and then I closed the laptop and sat very still, because reacting too fast would mean losing control. The plan didn't arrive fully formed. It grew quietly, fed by insomnia and research, and a part of me that had been patient for years. My firm could help him. We specialized in exactly the kind of restructuring his company would need to go national, and my reputation would open doors he wanted open. I told myself this was business curiosity, nothing more, even as my pulse sped up at the thought of being in the same room, of watching him not recognize me. I reached out through intermediaries, careful and professional, and when his team responded with interest, I felt a strange calm settle over me, like the moment after you decide to jump and before gravity does its work. The first call was scheduled for the following week. I stood in my office that morning, looking at my reflection in the glass, adjusting my jacket, my face composed and untraceable. Victoria Hale stared back at me, competent and cool, a woman built from intention. Claire Morgan stayed quiet somewhere deeper, holding her breath. As the phone rang and I reached to answer, a single thought cut through everything else, sharp and undeniable. If he didn't recognize me now, it meant he never really saw me then, and I wasn't sure yet whether that realization would be my shield or my undoing. He smiled at me across the conference table like we were meeting for the first time, and I felt something inside my chest go quiet in a way that scared me more than anger ever could. He said my new name smoothly, complimented my firm, asked about my flight, and not once did his eyes hesitate or narrow or do anything that suggested recognition. So I understood in that instant that whatever I had been to him all those years ago had been small enough to forget completely, and the question that followed me into that room settled heavily in my stomach. If he didn't see me, then what else had he been capable of doing without remembering? The meeting unfolded exactly the way I'd expected, which should have reassured me, but didn't. He was charming in a measured way, confident without being loud, surrounded by men who nodded at the right moments and deferred to him like gravity. I listened more than I spoke, letting him explain his expansion plans, the markets he wanted to enter, the risks he claimed to understand. When I finally leaned forward and offered a suggestion about restructuring his debt to make his next acquisition cleaner, his eyebrows lifted with genuine interest, and he said my name again, slower this time, like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. I felt the echo of another room, another version of him pacing while I labored, and I kept my voice steady because control had become my second language. By the end of the hour, he was asking for a follow-up, suggesting dinner to continue the conversation, and I nodded like this was just business, even as my pulse beat hard against my ribs. Dinner blurred lines I pretended not to see. We sat in a quiet restaurant near his hotel, the kind with low lighting and staff trained to be invisible, and he talked about pressure, about expectations, about how lonely leadership can be. I recognized the shape of his self-pity immediately. It was familiar, well-practiced, and still effective. When I asked about his family, carefully neutral, his jaw tightened for half a second before he smiled and said things were complicated, that public life demanded sacrifices. I watched his hands as he spoke, noticed the same habit of rubbing his thumb against his ring finger when he was thinking, and I felt an unsettling pull that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with unfinished business. When he walked me to a cab, he touched my elbow lightly and I didn't pull away, because every reaction was information and I was collecting it all. The deeper I stepped into his world, the easier it became to justify staying. My firm signed a consulting agreement, limited at first, and I flew back and forth twice that week, my calendar filling with meetings and site visits. He called more often than necessary, checking in, looping me into conversations I didn't strictly need to be part of, and I let him because proximity breeds access. At night, alone in hotel rooms that all smelled the same, I reminded myself why I was there, replayed the sound of rain on the chapel roof, the weight leaving my arms. Still, when he laughed at something I said, when he looked at me like I was capable and interesting and real, I hated myself a little for the warmth that sparked despite everything. The truth didn't come from him. It came from paper. During a routine review of archived expenses, a junior analyst flagged a set of old payments routed through a shell company that no longer existed, marked as security consulting. The dates stopped me cold. I knew them without checking because grief brands time into you. They aligned with the weeks after I'd left the mountains, after I'd told myself my child was gone, and there was nothing left to search for. I asked for more detail, my message casual, my body rigid, and when the documents arrived, my vision tunneled. The firm name meant nothing, but the location did. Mountain counties, remote access, discreet services. I sat very still at my desk, the city humming outside, and felt something old and raw wake up. I didn't confront him. I dug. Quietly, methodically, the way I'd learned to do everything that mattered. Public records dissolved LLCs, land leases, incident reports that never quite explained what had happened. There were gaps big enough to drive a truck through, and in those gaps, my imagination filled in shapes I didn't want to see. When I finally traced one of the contractors to a man who'd retired early and now ran a bait shop in a town not far from where the chapel stood, my hands shook so badly I had to set the phone down. I told myself I was still exaggerating, that correlation isn't causation, that I was letting emotion write a story facts hadn't confirmed, even as my chest burned with a certainty I couldn't reason away. The confrontation happened by accident, which is how the most important truths seem to surface. We were alone in a boardroom after everyone else had left, the city lights blinking on below us, and I asked him, lightly, about the shell companies, framing it as a due diligence concern. He didn't get defensive. He didn't get angry. He sighed, leaned back in his chair, and said there were things from his past he wasn't proud of. Decisions made under pressure to handle situations before they became public disasters. He met my eyes and told me some problems had to be erased before they could grow teeth. My breath caught, sharp and involuntary, and for a second, I thought I might pass out right there. But he kept talking, oblivious, explaining how he'd believed the issue resolved, how he'd been assured there were no loose ends. I left without saying another word, my legs carrying me out on instinct while my mind reeled. In the elevator, I pressed my forehead against the cool metal wall and closed my eyes, because if I opened them, I was afraid I'd scream. By the time I reached the street, the decision had already been made somewhere deep and irreversible. This wasn't about recognition anymore, or revenge shaped like romance, or proving anything to myself. He had tried to erase my child like she was a line item, and even if he believed he'd succeeded, he was wrong about one thing. I was a loose end, and I was done staying quiet. I didn't destroy him all at once because collapse is more convincing when it looks like a series of unfortunate events instead of a single, obvious blow. And by the time he realized his life was unraveling, there was no clear place for him to point and say, "This is where it started." I watched it happen from close enough to feel the tremors, calm on the surface, methodical underneath, and I understood with a kind of detached clarity that once you step into this role, there's no clean way back to who you were before. The first crack came from the numbers. I adjusted forecasts, not dishonestly, but precisely, highlighting risks his team had always minimized and insisting on safeguards that slowed momentum at exactly the wrong moments. Investors grew cautious. Deals that had felt inevitable began to stall, then quietly dissolve. He called me late one night, his voice tight, asking why sentiment had shifted so suddenly, and I answered carefully, telling him markets were sensitive, that optics mattered, that patience would protect him in the long run. I could hear him pacing, the familiar rhythm, and when he thanked me for being steady when others weren't, something twisted in my chest that I refused to name. Pressure exposed what charm had hidden. As the weeks passed, internal emails leaked through channels I knew how to open, not to the press yet, but to the people who mattered. Board members started asking questions about legacy decisions, old expenditures that didn't align with the values he preached publicly. A journalist called for comment about a discontinued subsidiary connected to security services in rural counties, framing it as a curiosity piece at first, and when I mentioned it to him over coffee, he laughed it off, said reporters chase ghosts when they're bored. His laugh sounded brittle to me, like glass tapped too hard. I nodded, played my part, and made a note to move faster. The exposure gained its own gravity. Once doubt enters a room, it doesn't leave easily, and soon there were audits, and then subpoenas, and then the kind of silence from political allies that speaks louder than any statement. His wife stopped attending public events. Donations were returned. Contracts were paused, pending review. I watched his name shift in headlines from visionary to controversial to embattled, the adjectives doing their quiet work of dismantling reputation. Through it all, he leaned on me, calling more frequently, confiding in me with a desperation that felt obscene given what I now knew. He said I was the only one who seemed to understand him, and when he said that, I almost laughed at the accuracy of it. The moment I'd imagined for years arrived in the most unceremonious way. We were standing in his office after hours, boxes stacked along one wall because he'd been told to clear out temporarily, the city outside indifferent to his fall. He looked smaller, older, his confidence frayed at the edges, and he asked me quietly if I thought he was finished. I studied his face, this man who had once looked at me like I was a complication to be managed, and I answered honestly that I didn't know. Something in my tone must have shifted, because he frowned, searching my expression like it held a code he'd missed. I told him my real name then. I didn't raise my voice or dramatize it. I just said it, letting it land between us like a dropped plate. He repeated it once, confused, and then again, slower, and I watched recognition bloom in his eyes in stages. Memory, disbelief, horror. His mouth opened, closed, and he took a step back like the floor had moved. He said my name again, this time like a plea, and asked how, asked why, asked what I wanted. I felt oddly empty in that moment, like the act of revealing myself had drained whatever fuel anger had left me. I didn't answer his questions. I didn't need to. The truth was already doing its work. I walked out of that office without looking back, my heels clicking against the floor in a steady rhythm that felt like punctuation. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, and I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, waiting for triumph to arrive. It didn't. What arrived instead was a hollow ache, a reminder that bringing someone to their knees doesn't resurrect what was taken from you. As I turned toward the street, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number containing a single line that made my blood run cold, because it opened the one door I'd never allowed myself to push on. If you're still looking for her, you should come back to the mountains. I stood at the edge of the Blue Ridge Trail with my phone clenched in my hand, 14 years of certainty dissolving with every breath I took, because I had built my entire life around the belief that my child was gone, and now a single message had undone everything I thought I knew. The mountains looked the same and not the same at all, older somehow, quieter, and as I started walking, I realized this was the one place where revenge couldn't follow me, where the only thing waiting was the truth I'd been too afraid to imagine. The town was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was just bigger now, filled with years and defenses that didn't belong here. I checked into a modest motel with creaking stairs and a lobby that smelled like coffee that had been reheated too many times, and the woman at the desk asked what brought me back like it was a harmless question. I said I was visiting because saying I was searching felt too close to hope. That night, I barely slept, listening to trucks pass on the highway and rehearsing conversations that might never happen, my mind jumping between images of a child frozen in time and the possibility of a grown stranger who owed me nothing. The next morning, I followed directions to a ranger station just outside the park boundary, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I told myself to be calm, to ask questions like a normal person, to not let my voice betray me. Inside, maps lined the walls, boots were stacked by the door, and behind the counter stood a young woman in a green uniform, her hair pulled back, her posture easy and grounded in a way that caught my attention immediately. When she looked up and smiled, something in my chest stuttered. Not recognition exactly, but a pull I couldn't explain. She asked how she could help me, her voice steady, curious, and I felt dizzy with the effort of staying upright. I told her I was looking for information about an old chapel, one that used to stand farther up the ridge, and she nodded slowly, like the question carried weight. She said locals still talked about it sometimes, about a storm years ago, about a baby found wrapped in a blanket by a family who kept sheep in the valley. My breath came shallow as she spoke, and when she reached up absent-mindedly and touched the chain at her neck, my vision blurred. Hanging there was a silver medallion, worn smooth with time, engraved with my name. I don't remember sitting down, only that suddenly I was in a chair and she was asking if I was okay, concern threading her voice. The words came out of me unevenly, stripped of strategy and armor. I told her who I was. I told her about the storm, the chapel, the necklace. I told her I'd believed she was gone because believing that had been the only way to survive. She listened without interrupting, her face pale, her hand pressed flat against her chest, like she was holding herself together. When I finished, the room felt too small for the silence that followed. Finally, she whispered my name, not as a question but as a confirmation, and something in her expression broke open. She told me about the family who raised her, about growing up loved but always wondering, about the necklace she'd been told was the only clue to where she came from. We cried then, quietly, not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the kind that leaves you wrung out and shaky, like your body is relearning how to breathe. There were no speeches about forgiveness, no neat resolution that tied everything together. There was just the two of us, sitting across from each other, connected by blood and loss, and a story that had nearly erased us both. She didn't call me Mom, and I didn't ask her to, because some things need time to earn their names. We walked the trail later that afternoon, the same ridge where everything had fallen apart, the sun cutting through the thinning mist like it was unsure it belonged there. She talked about her life, about the work she loved, about staying because the mountains felt like home, and I listened without interrupting, understanding that love doesn't give you the right to rewrite someone else's story. At the overlook, she stopped, took my hand once, briefly, like a decision still forming, and that was all. I had destroyed a man who believed he could erase his mistakes, and in doing so, I learned something I hadn't planned for at all. Revenge doesn't give you a future, it only clears the ground. I got everything I thought I wanted, and for the first time in my life, I had no idea what to do with it.